We're going to explain today the difference between the Matlab functions of RAND and RANDI. So RAND is a function that returns a floating point or a decimal between 0 and 1, but 1 is not included, so 1 is excluded. So it's going to return a decimal point between 0 and 0.999. The keywords for the RAND function are floating point, which is just another word for decimal point, and upper limit, not included. The RANDI function, on the other hand, returns a number between 1 and some upper limit. So the computer already knows it begins at 1, it's already programmed like this. But we have to give it an upper limit. So if you run in the computer, if you just say RAND and you run it, the computer is already going to know to give you a random floating point or a random decimal number between 0 and 1, 1 not included. So it's going to be anything between 0 and 0.9999. The RANDI function, on the other hand, you have to give it an upper limit. If you just say RANDI and you run it, it's going to give you an error because it's not going to know what the upper limit is that you want it to return the random integer for. So for RANDI, you will say, let's say in this case it's going to be 10. So you want a random integer between 1 and 10. And so in this case will be 1 and 10. 10 will be included. So RANDI does not return decimals, it just returns integers or whole numbers. That's another word for whole numbers. So the keywords for RANDI are integer and upper limit included. So let's say a problem says assign a random floating point number to the variable a. So which one of these two functions do you think that you will need to use? You will need to use RAND because it's asking for a floating point number that is a decimal number. RANDI does not return decimal numbers. So in this case, if you wanted to assign a random floating point number to a variable a, you will just say a equals RAND. And that will give you, each time you run it, it's going to give you a different random. It's randomly going to pick, each time you run it, a different floating point number, just like the coin machines, you run it and it gives you a different combination every time. So in this case, it can give you 0.1547 or 0. The next time you run it, it could be 5671. The next time you run it can be 0.9678. So it's going to be between 0 and 0.999. It's never really going to hit 1. With the RANDI operation function is the same. So this is just going to give you when you say RANDI of 10 and you run it, each time you run it, it's going to give you a random. It's randomly going to pick a number between 1 and 10. So the first time maybe you get 6, the next one you might get 3, the next one you may get 5, the next one you may get 1, the next time you may get 2, etc. So those are those two functions. Let's say that you have a problem that is worded like this. It says assign a random floating point number between 0 inclusive and 10 exclusive, so upper limit is excluded, to a variable z. So we already know, just by the word floating point, that the function that we're going to need is a RAND function. And it reinforces that notion because it's saying that the upper limit is going to be excluded. And the RAND function, the upper limit is excluded, while in the RANDI function, the upper limit is included. So the way we're going to do this is we're going to say z equals. So we know it's a RAND function already, so we're going to say RAND. And then, but RAND is only going to give us a floating point number up to 1, but 1 not included. And we need to expand it to 10. So how we do that is that we can multiply this function, which is going to be up to 1, but never really quite getting to 1, by 10, by the upper limit that is going to be excluded. And so the way this works is that when you run RAND, it starts at 0, basically is the minimum. So let's say if this works for the minimum. So if you run RAND, if you say z equals RAND, so the computer is going to do this first. So RAND, and it gives you the lowest possible value that it can give you, 0 right here. So in this case, if this gives you 0, which is the minimum and is a possibility, then when you multiply it by 10, this gives you 0. So we're good here because the lower limit being included is met. So this function meets the minimum requirement that it has to be between 0 as the minimum lower limit. So now the upper limit is saying 10 exclusive. So let's see if we multiply this by 10, if that will work. So let's say, so the upper limit of RAND is going to be, let's say, 0.999, because it's never going to get to 1. If this got to 1, then what you will have is a 1, and the upper limit then would be 1 times 10, which will equal 10. And we don't want that because they want it to be not included. So because the RAND function never gets to 1, when they ask you for a number between 0 and 10 exclusive, you can actually multiply a RAND function by 10 because RAND is never going to be 1. So therefore, you're never going to have 10. So for example, if you have 0.999 times 10, which is going to be, you know, this is going to be the maximum number, the highest value that RAND is going to at any given point give you, then what you have is basically, I change my code pretty much every day. So, so basically you have 0.999 times 10. So do you think this is going to return 10 to you? No, it's going to return 9.99 because the only way that you can have 10 returned is if you multiply it by 1, and RAND is never going to get to 1. So when you have a question like this, assign a random floating point number, that's a RAND function, between 0 and 10 exclusive to a variable z, all you have to say is z, assign it a random number, and then multiply it by the upper limit that they're asking you. Because RAND is never going to get to 1, you're never going to get to 10. So this will be the answer to a question like this. Next, another question says, assign a random integer between 6 inclusive and 16 inclusive to a variable a. So which function do you think that's gonna need between these two? So it's gonna be a RANDI function because it's asking for an integer. That's the number one reason. But then it's also reinforcing it by saying that the upper limit is included. So 16 is included. So we know this is going to be a RANDI function just by this. So we say A is going to equal. Now this one is going to be a little bit different because the RANDI function begins at 1. So it begins at 1 and it goes to some upper limit. In this case, it's going to be 16. So here what we're going to do is that we're going to start at the lower limit that they're asking, and we're going to subtract 1 from this. So they want it to start at 6. So we're going to subtract 1. So we're going to say 6 minus 1 equals 5. So we're going to say 5 here. And in this case, we're going to add it, and we're going to say RANDI of the upper limit, the upper limit is going to be the difference between 5, which is 1 less than the minimum, and the upper limit that they're asking you. So 16 minus 5 is 11. So the reason for this is because what you have is this integer plus this function, which returns an integer as well. So this is going to be one number plus another number. And so for RANDI 11, we know that RANDI, the minimum value that it gives you is 1. So if you run this and you happen to get the minimum lower limit of RANDI, which is 1, is the minimum it can return, and it does return a 1, then what you will have is 5 plus 1 equals 6. So the minimum that this function can return is a 6, which is what they're asking. They're asking for a number between 6, so that's the minimum, and 16. Now when you have RANDI 11, the highest number that this RANDI function can give you is what? Just the RANDI function. What's the highest random number that this can give you? It's going to be 11. So if when you run this code, this part of the code gives you an 11, the uppermost possible one, then what you're going to have 5 plus 11, which equals 16, which is your upper limit. So this is why when you have a question like this, assign a random integer between this number and another number included to a variable, in this case a, what you want to do is you want to say a equals to, you take the lower limit, subtract 1, say 5, and then add, then plus RANDI of the difference between the number that you picked, which is 1 less than the minimum, and the upper limit. And this way you will be between these limits that they're asking you for. So that's those problems. And then as far as arrays, the way it works with these two functions is that if, let's say the question says, assign a random floating point number to each element of an array that is 5 by 5. So what you will say is the RAND function, if it's an array of 5 by 5, you will just say RAND of 5. You could also say RAND of, and it works as well, RAND of 5 by 5, but it's not needed necessarily. So with RAND, you will say, let's say RAND of 5, and it will already know that you mean that this is an array. That is because this function does not have an upper limit like RANDI does. So RANDI has this sort of parenthesis number because that's the upper limit. RAND does not have that. So when you add this number, RAND is actually going to turn this into an array that's going to be 5 by 5 or 4 by 4, whatever, 26 by 26, whatever number you give it. And so when you say RAND of 5, it's going to return an array of 5 rows and 5 columns. And it's going to assign a random floating point number, random decimal number between 0 and 1 not included, to each element. The RANDI function works like this. So with RANDI, if you wanted to assign, you say a random integer to each element of an array, and the array is, let's say, 10 by 10, then RANDI, you will actually need to say 10 by 10 so that it knows that it's not just an upper limit. Because if you do these just like that, then it's going to think that you just want a random integer between 1 and 10. So you have to actually give it this is the row, that's the column. So you have to add that so that it knows it's going to be that. And so this would be, if it's 10 by 10, then it will be 10 random numbers between basically 1 and 10. So, okay, I hope that helps.